Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to have you visit with our ministerial candidate, Mandy Huizinga, and we are looking forward to conversation. We would love this to be more of a dialogue. Questions, Mandy may have some questions for us about our experiences here. So it will definitely be a conversation. If you're joining us live stream, we will be able to pick up questions, so if you have a question, please feel free to add that. But otherwise, if either one of Linda or Sherry have something to start off with, you're welcome to do that, or we're ready.
Okay, well, I don't have anything. This is my third time.
Hello.
One of your questions, Karen.
Welcome.
So, Mandy, I would love to have you describe to the people here your call to ministry.
They asked me this question earlier today, so this is
Really?
actually the second time that I'm answering
so
this
you're
one.
well-practiced.
I am, and it's I warn you all that it's a bit of an emotional roller coaster for me, and so there are moments that sometimes I get a little teary. So in 2017, it was quite a year for the UUA in 2017. It was quite a year for me as well. So I was the congregational administrator at our church in Morristown, New Jersey. And I was pretty much the only staff member that was full-time in the building at that moment because our minister was running for UUA president and our director of religious education was on the UUA board. And if you recall the happenings at that time in the UUA, you will remember that that is when the hiring controversy for the Southern Regional Lead, I think that's what they're calling that now. And that fiasco, for lack of a better term, resulted in the resignation of Reverend Peter Morales as the UUA president, two other high-level positions, and also Don Southworth resigned from the UU Ministers Association. And so the UUA had three interim presidents at that moment. And that's when the board of the UUA, at the recommendation of the interim presidents, created the Commission on Institutional Change, which published their report, Widening the Circle of Concern, in June of 2020. My partner was on that commission. And that spring was really hard for me. Not only was I the only staff member in our church, which was also in the middle of a lawsuit because the township had just approved expansion on our building, and the neighbors were up in arms about it, and they sued the congregation. So I'm the only staff person. I am in the midst of hearing all these horrible stories that were coming out of the UUA. And it was the trustees, and it was the presidential search, and it was the horror stories coming in to the Commission on Institutional Change about the ways that we had failed, especially religious professionals of color and trans folk. And Unitarian Universalism broke my heart that spring. I was devastated by this faith that I had called home, that had loved me into being. And I was exhausted as a staff member trying to do all the things that I was doing. And I went to General Assembly, and there was so much buzz. There was buzz around the presidential election. There was buzz around the commission's work. There were buzz around the stories that were happening. And I was walking through the convention center with my children, holding my hands, and I just had this moment. I don't know if I want to call it a voice in my head. I don't believe in God. I do believe the universe speaks to us in very obvious ways sometimes. But I had this moment as I'm walking through the General Assembly Convention Center that I have certain skills. I don't have all the skills to be a minister, but I have certain skills, especially around organizational management and structure, and governance structures that really lend itself to creating systems that are anti-oppressive, anti-racist. And that maybe I should use those skills to help create congregations that are healthy, that religious professionals can thrive in, that congregations can grow in and learn in. And so out of that really deep call, I said no, because that's what you do when you get a call to ministry. You don't say, oh yeah, that sounds like fun. You actually sit there and you say, no, I don't want that responsibility. That is too much for me. And in the next month and a half, that call was just reiterated over and over and over again. And I finally said, okay, fine, I will apply to seminary. And what I will tell you is that from that moment forward, when I didn't fight any of it, when I actually applied, when I didn't actually try to figure out how all the finances were going to work or how I was going to manage all my scheduling, everything just fell into place. It's not to say that I didn't have to work, because I totally had to work for every single one of those A's that I earned in seminary. And when I did it and I was listening and I was paying attention, it really just all fit. It all just landed in place exactly the way it was supposed to. And so the call hasn't left. It was that moment in the convention center at General Assembly, but it's here right now as I sit before you. All of the things that I am skilled at, all of the things that you want to accomplish that I have heard already in this week, it's all fitting. It's all fitting so perfectly. That's out of my hands for certain. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Questions from the folks gathered here? This is just an open conversation and dialogue, so Mandy is happy to answer questions. I have some others, but what
Yeah,
about
right behind you.
guys?
Randy Mandy.
Randy,
Okay.
Mandy.
We're out of practice with our name tags.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting when you comment on your talents with organizational and governance. And what's impressed me about you so far, just even in the way you're talking now about sort of trusting in an unfolding, and it seems like it's a level of consciousness that the world so sorely needs, and I guess it's from your sermon on Sunday, it just seems that you're bringing so much more than organizational. I mean, and maybe talk a little bit more about just kind of that worldview that you hold that influences how you see sharing that and the purpose of sharing that, and where where you see Unitarians in that stream of consciousness and range of consciousness.
Yeah. That actually, a lot of that, my understanding of the world and myself and my call comes a lot from the journey that I took to heal a lot of my childhood trauma, actually. And one of the things that I realized, and this feeds right into my call, is that when we are aware of ourselves, when there's a self-awareness about who we are, what we can do, what our limitations are, we can actually grow, and we can really embody what we want to be, who we want to be. We can live into our UU practices when we have a self-awareness. I did not have self-awareness for a very long time. And part of that was trauma. Part of that was not really recognizing how important that was. And that was something that I have intentionally cultivated. But it actually aligns really well with my own Taoist theology. And that is, I use some philosophers' translation of the Tao, which is not the way, but as a means to making our life significant. And I think it aligns so perfectly with Unitarian Universalism. What we want to accomplish as a faith, how we want to embody our Unitarian Universalist principles, that is about cultivating our self-awareness and self-betterment, is essentially what it is. And if you ask me, that's what Unitarian Universalism is, a faith that evolves. Reverend David Pyle gave a fantastic sermon at the Meadville commencement last year. You can find it online on YouTube. And he talks about how he has had congregants come to him and said, this is not the faith that I joined 20 years ago. No, it's not, and it shouldn't be. We should be learning and growing. We should be a dynamic faith that when we find that we've made mistakes, that we go to rectify them and become better as a faith. And to do that, we need self-awareness. We need to be in community where we can hold each other accountable and have good boundaries. And so all of those pieces of my own journey also inform and I think align really well with my understanding of what Unitarian Universalism is and what it can be, right?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I remember your sermon on, I think it's the heart sermon, and I was just ecstatic when I was listening to that and imagining what you're bringing, and you're responding like that.
Yeah.
Very congruent with the message in that talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I just want to add a comment to what you
Yeah,
said about,
absolutely.
pardon?
Absolutely.
Yeah, about the living faith. I think we think about the living faith, but don't really think about or internalize what that means.
Right.
If we think about it as a living faith, then what that means is we're open to all other possibilities of change as they come up, and what we have to adapt to and understand and accept with head and heart.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easy to talk about it up here, but what are we internalizing and believing and living out day to day?
Right. Yeah. And that's actually that sermon that was about that dichotomy between head and heart, and about so there's a theologian, Dorothy Sowell, who talks about she actually creates a trinity between mind, heart, and soul, but what she talks about as soul is our actions, our being, our body. And so, and then she translates that into worship, which we could go there if you want. But the idea being that, I think about intellectual exercises are great, but if you don't have that heart piece, you're not actually going to do anything with your body out in the world. You're just going to have that great speech prepared when you need to, but you're not actually living that action. And I think that this is probably likely a result of our history with the Enlightenment, is that we've become so over-intellectualized that we don't actually use our hearts and bodies as often as we should. And we need to also incorporate those aspects as well. Yeah.
We all know that the expectations for a minister are so many and varied.
Yes.
What is your self-care plan?
So at its most basic, I make sure I get a good night's sleep, and I make sure I'm fed. I know many ministers who will pile on their meetings and skip lunch. I won't do that. I will actually, even if it means I have to go to a meeting and eat my lunch, I will make sure I have my food. And I need rest because I don't function well when I don't have sleep. But I also take all of my vacation time intentionally because I need to renew and rest myself so that I can be the best minister I can be for you all. But I also have daily practices. I go on my long walks if I have my garden. I'm really hoping I can have a garden next year. I love to be in my garden. And I have a form of Qigong that I practice. And that also helps me ground myself. You may have seen me doing that in my office earlier.
Can you talk a little bit more about that for some of us who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah. So Shigong is similar to Tai Chi. It's so if you've done Tai Chi, it's usually a movement piece. The form of Qigong I do there's actually 3 of them, but all of them have movements that are actually, you could do it right now while you're sitting. And there's actually one form that is non-moving. And the idea is about cultivating energy, but it's also about mindfulness and just bringing ourselves back to our center and grounding ourselves in the moment. And so that's a practice that I actually started as I was doing some energetic healing stuff. I do believe in, as I told my friend, I believe in all the medicines. I'm definitely a Western doctor medicine, but I actually believe in acupuncture, and I believe in alternative sources as well. And I actually started doing it as a way to help with my migraines, which I get. And it's helped significantly with just keeping me grounded in the moment. So, yeah. Yeah.
I noticed that you've attended 2 theological schools. Is
Yeah.
that true? Both are not Unitarian affiliated,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not here nor there. But I also think that if you do attend theological school in a non-UU format, you have an unusual kind of experience. And I just wondered if you could talk about how that has been for you. What did you learn? What in that journey?
Right. So actually, I started off at Drew Theological School, and I transferred to Chicago Theological School when we moved here. And I didn't apply to Meadville because my partner is the president there, and conflict of interest and all that. But I actually started at Drew because he was a professor there, and those were professors that actually most of them are dear friends of our family. And I knew and understood where they were approaching Christianity from, and so I actually trusted my ability to be in that context, even as a UU. I knew that my thoughts and my opinions would be respected, even if they weren't agreed with. So that was one of the reasons. The other reason I intentionally chose Drew was because I really wanted to have interaction with other faith traditions. I wanted to be able to have conversations with somebody who was super conservative Christian, and to be able to have that dialogue and find respect and dignity for both of us in that moment. Because I'm hoping that in our congregational work that we can dialogue with other faiths. I don't want to be a silo and say we're the only ones doing this and we're going to do it by ourselves. No, it's going to be more powerful if we can do justice work as a collective. And so that's why I chose Christian seminaries, is because I wanted to be able to do that. I also believe that despite its faults, Christian tradition is rich. It has a millennia of research, of theology. Not that it's all great, but that tradition is rich, and they've been through many different iterations. And so there's a lot that I learned, a lot of translating. I mean, I read a theology book and I have to translate a lot of it, especially because I'm a Taoist as well, right? But that was a really important part of my experience, was being able to do that and to learn from that. So that's what I've chosen to do, and it's been a really rich experience for me. And then at CTS, I had the gift of, there were 2 gifts at CTS, and one is that CTS has an agreement with Bayan University, which is a Muslim school. And so I actually had Muslim students in my classes as well, which was really exciting because now I've been introduced to another faith tradition. But I also had a professor a rabbi who taught Hebrew Bible. So I was able to actually get the Hebrew biblical perspective from a Jewish professor and not just from Christian professors. And that was incredibly rich. The stuff that I've learned about some of the prophet books has been extraordinary and really exciting. And I'm excited to bring it to congregations because it's a very unique perspective, especially since many of us come from Christian backgrounds. That was incredibly interesting. So those were why I chose it and some of the things that I've learned in that place. Yeah. Thank you. That's a good question. I haven't been asked that one yet.
So I'll ask another one. tell us a little bit about your experience as a congregational administrator, and then how you feel that will inform your work as a minister, how that kind of gives you maybe a bit of a head start in terms of understanding all that complexity.
Right.
And just an aside of it,
Yeah.
in the description of it, it seemed like it also overlapped with what we have had here as more like a membership person.
Mm-hmm.
Is that accurate? So just to
Yes.
kind of translate from our point of view here.
Right. So a congregational administrator is one of the most interesting positions in a congregation because every church defines that role slightly differently depending on what it is that you need. And I was somewhere between like an executive director, like if you had a nonprofit management, like that kind of role, and a congregational life person. And it depended on the day as to which end of that spectrum I was. What I will tell you is that it started out much more as executive director, and as time went on, it became much more membership professional. In fact, to the point that had I stayed and not gotten my call to ministry, it's likely we would have had conversations around me becoming a director of congregational life rather than congregational administrator, because that's how it had slowly evolved. So over time, I had pretty much everything that happens in a church on my plate, except I was not responsible for preaching, and I was not directly responsible for religious education, definitely not of children, but I actually intersected with religious ed as it relates to membership. So things like leadership development, getting to know you classes, that sort of thing. Over time, what I realized is that I can put together a newsletter just as well as any person can put together a newsletter, but that really wasn't how I needed to spend my time. That was not how I needed to spend it. And so one of the biggest parts of my job ended up becoming volunteer recruitment and management. I had on average in my week somewhere between 7 and 10 volunteers that would come in and do mostly communications, but also answering my phone and whatnot. And so eventually things like newsletter and all of those pieces I was overseeing, but I actually had volunteers doing that work. I oversaw our finance person, who also ended up getting facilities. I offloaded that to her because it made sense. She was handling the finances for rentals. It made sense that she then kind of took on the rest of the facilities stuff. And I also oversaw our custodial staff. As things moved along, I really pushed our membership and welcoming program, because that was our congregation had this narrative for many, many years that they weren't welcoming, that they just didn't have, they would lose people as soon as they came in the door. And it wasn't true, honestly. It just wasn't true. And in the first year that I was there, between myself and the minister, there were 35 new members. And it was because we actually made that process intentional. We cultivated a group of people just to look at welcoming, just to make sure that the welcome table process ran smoothly, but also how we tracked people, how we contacted them after their first couple of visits, how we got them involved in membership classes, meeting the new minister, and then doing direct asks. Are you ready to sign the membership book, right? And so we did that, and that program became super robust. We had just about a year and a half before I left, we had implemented our engagement program, and it was just starting to take off as I left. And engagement was taking people, so we had the pathway to membership, but engagement can be described as the pathway through membership. And so we had divided that pathway into different categories. So we had new members, we had engaged members, committed members, leader members, and then we would actually have a category called at-rest members. And so the idea was that we would take at-rest members.
Like non-active,
not active.
but they're not.
Not deceased.
Yes. No, not deceased. No, we actually ended up having a special category for, elderly folks that, wanted to be part of the congregation but could no longer participate, and we wanted to make sure that we kept in contact with them, especially as you were homebound, because...
That's that category?
Nope, that was a whole nother category. So the idea being that, as a new member, you'd start to really understand what it meant to be a member, right? So you would take UU theology classes, UU history classes. We would really talk about what it meant to pledge and volunteer your time. And then that would deepen as we would go on. So then you'd get committed members, and that would just take things a little bit more deeply, or engaged and then committed. And so each level got you deeper until you got to leader members. And then they would do anti-racist, anti-oppression training. They would take some classes. I mean, I know you all have done the Midwest Leadership School, but we on the East Coast, there was some through the Central East region, but there's also, the UUA has the Leadership Institute, and so there are also classes through there, and we would offer those. Our nominating would offer a leadership class. And then the at-rest category was especially for the board and especially for committee chairs. And it was an opportunity for them to take a year off. They would often... So they would often still be involved in like more minor tasks, and by that I mean things that weren't so time consuming, right? So they might then be willing to staff the welcome table on Sunday morning and volunteer once a month just to do that, or maybe help out once a month in RE. But we actually had programming set up to renew their spirits. There is a trend in Unitarian Universalism, I don't remember the number, but there is a number of how many board presidents leave congregations after their tenure.
The other at-risk position is the chairman of the
Search committee. But board presidents will get so burned out that they will leave the congregation after their presidency. And we wanted to stop that trend. And sometimes it even extended to other board members, not just the president. And so one way to do that is by having this category that, like, it was almost sacred. Like, when somebody had been in a high-level leadership like that, we were like, nope, we're not going to ask them to do something intense. Right now is your time to rest, to renew your soul, so that maybe you can come back and do something high-level again, but you really need to have a moment to be calm and to ground yourself again. And so that was how things slowly worked. And then what we did is we actually structured it so we had welcoming, engagement, caring, and publicity. I think that was the 4 categories. And I'm not sure why publicity got put in there, because it kind of makes sense, but those things happen. But caring also got in there because those areas, welcoming, membership, and caring, those interact a lot. But over time, they interact with other groups too, right? So stewardship needs the resources of membership engagement. They need to know what's going on in the congregation, which directly relates to finances and all of those pieces. So membership became a huge part of my portfolio eventually because of that. Because we really wanted to have an integrated whole church ministry. We were headed in that direction. So, yeah.
How long did you hold that position in Oak Park?
That was actually in New Jersey.
Oh, you held one in New Jersey as well?
Yes. That was as the congregational administrator, and I was there for 4.5 years.
I see, and then came into
Oak Park.
Oak Park.
As an intern.
As an intern, a ministerial intern.
I see.
Yes.
Were all of the former leaders, say presidents of the congregation, happy with this business of taking a respite year?
Yeah. Yes. Very, very, very happy with the respite here. Yes. I mean, and if they had still wanted to do something intense, that was, of course, their prerogative. But we were not going to necessarily ask them to do that. Yeah.
I heard part of Madeline Albright's funeral just now. And somebody was quoting from things she'd written and said she had learned more about politics being on a board in the church.
I'm not surprised.
And she never did anywhere else.
Yes. Welcome.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Lynn Calvin.
Lynn, nice to meet you, Mandy. Yeah.
Maybe you could say a little bit about how you see probably the reality of a hybrid world and how that's going to affect the dynamic of a church operation.
And membership.
Yes. Yeah. So I have become abundantly aware of the fact that what it means to be a member is going to change as we become more and more remote as well, right? And there are really good reasons for doing accessibility is the least of them, but maybe one of the most important reasons for us to be hybrid. And yeah, it is going to be different. I have suspicions, but I don't actually know what it's going to look like in the future. I do believe that you all have set yourself up with some really good infrastructure from the beginning that's quite literally light years ahead of other congregations. You have the technology in both Creeves Hall and your founder's room here to do Zoom meetings in ways that are inclusive. It's astounding to me because most other congregations don't make things accessible except Sunday mornings. So we have some framework to work with, but yeah, I don't know what that's going to look like. And I'm willing to experiment. I'm willing to try new things. And some of those will fail and some of those will succeed. And that's the nature of evolving technology and evolving community. I think the most important thing is just being aware. Being aware that not making assumptions that everybody's going to be at church at a certain time for a certain meeting, right? And if we're aware that we cannot approach things from one particular place, I think that kind of starts opening up that dialogue. What do we need to make this more inclusive? What do we need to define membership differently? Because volunteerism is just going to look differently if we have a member who lives in Russia, right? It's going to look different. And Unity Temple they've had members or people join in from overseas to their worship services who are interested in what it means to be a member. And so I would not be surprised if that happens at DuPage. And when that happens, we're going to have to open our minds a little bit bigger and expand those definitions a little bit more. But you all have started doing some of that work, and we'll just keep evolving it as things happen. Because I don't think we can fully anticipate all of these pieces. Yeah.
When these meetings were scheduled, I was remembering, I've been a member here since '88, and I was remembering frustration I had when I was working in Chicago, my husband was working in Oak Brook, and there'd be all this stuff scheduled at church in the middle of the day. And Carol and I had been talking about that actually. And then I realized when I was thinking about this, as I was rolling out of my nice retired bed this morning, and other days, that the flip side of it is that my sense that you couldn't get to these kinds of meetings changes somewhat. Again, when you also have remote participation. So, and I'm a high-tech person. I mean, you said that we're ahead. We were the 4th congregation to have a website in the New York.
Wow, that's impressive.
Congregation to have a website.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
I didn't know that either.
That's amazing.
So,
Lynn, do you remember what year?
Is that how you know that you worked on it?
yeah,
Good for you.
Mark and I put it up. We were involved in denominational stuff. And the UUA didn't have a website yet, so that would have been
Not surprised.
early 90s?
Wow.
Okay.
Early
That's
90s.
early. That's
So
really
Mark
early.
Gibbons, who Lynn is referring to, right? Mark Gibbons
Yes.
was Kendall Gibbons' husband, but
Oh, okay.
he was also a tech guy and
Yes.
Right.
loved technology and loved getting things out there and, you know, pushing that
Right.
envelope. I did not realize that, Lynn, no, that
Yeah, well, we were the
fourth.
fourth. Shelter Rock,
That doesn't surprise me.
I mean, quote Shelter Rock.
Yes.
I know, there were 3 others that had
Interesting.
ahead of us, but,
Hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, the web was a baby, so.
Yes, it was. It was a baby. Yeah. I'm sorry, you had a question or comment?
No, I was going to point out in a quiet moment that there are 3 of us here with the same first name.
Yes.
No, not the same person. I'm different.
Yeah, I know.
I'm an INE,
She's
right?
the INE,
Yeah.
and Carolyn and I are the Carols.
Okay.
We had 3.
Carolyn.
I was going to ask, what is the membership of the Oak Park Church right now?
I believe they're at 550.
550?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, they had been at 650 at one point. I think the pandemic hit them really hard, which is not unusual. Many churches do.
Who is the minister again?
Well, they're going through transition. So Reverend Alan Taylor was there, and he left last spring. So right now they have Reverend Dawn Cooley, and she started August 1st of last year. Yeah,
Is she an interim?
she is an interim. Yes,
Where's the former minister? Where did he go?
he didn't go anywhere.
Decided not to be minister.
There are things happening about that. I can't say more.
Yes. I'll record that. Here's this congregation.
So just a comment, Mandy.
Yeah.
Kat Gelder just texted, she said
Okay.
she's watching live stream.
Oh, wonderful.
It's hard sometimes to hear.
Okay.
Not
me,
you,
the
but
questions.
a
Okay.
question from the audience, so if you could
Repeat
perhaps
them.
repeat it,
Absolutely.
that would be helpful.
Yes, I
But
can do
she's
that.
enjoying it.
Awesome.
That's cool.
Great, I can.
Speaking of that, that would be a nice thing for you guys with the stories on Sunday. The kids' questions,
Yes.
some of them were allowing, Steve repeated a few, but some we couldn't hard, and I don't have a hearing issue.
But
so-
I do.
But I couldn't hear all of them, so that's.
Thank you.
It's so hard to remember when you're in it, I get it, but it's.
No, but thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. Yes. Steve
So this
is up there, and I heard
it
it here.
This is a tech issue. This is exactly what we're dealing
Yeah.
with in this multi-platform.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes. And it's also, we have to remember to repeat as well. Yeah, it's all of it. Yeah. Yeah.
So just sort of the general, is there an optimistic sense in Unitarian Universalism in general about kind of maybe the pulling away from mainline churches and picking up a broader market, or how do you anticipate growth, or what do you and membership here as we over the next decade or something?
So, going to repeat, anticipating membership and growth. Do you mean specifically for DuPage, or do you mean?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Well, does it fit, and is there a general pattern, and will we pick up on that, or just maybe I was intrigued just by you commenting on how that diligence in Oak Park, I guess were you talking about Oak Park or New Jersey?
Morristown.
Okay, that kind of garnering really has a payoff to you. So how do you see our numbers 10 years from now?
So I want to speak first to the larger UU context, and then I'll speak more to DuPage. The UU world is at a weird crossroads, and part of it is just the general demographics of religion in the United States, right? It's shrinking, period. And it doesn't, unless you're talking about Pentecostalism or Islam. Those are the two groups that are growing. I do believe that I've heard that Jehovah's Witnesses are growing too, which is a odd dynamic as well, mainly in Latin America, but they've been growing as well, which is very interesting. Unitarian Universalism has a really bad history of proselytizing. And I don't mean that as conversion, which is how Christian traditions use that. I mean that as just getting the word out that we exist. And so one of the things that we really need to do is get our name out there, period, because people don't know we exist. And so that's part of what needs to happen. The UU is also, Unitarian Universalism is also facing a larger issue, and that is around racial and anti-oppression issues. Absolutely. And I'm not sure people really understand, and I don't mean DuPage specifically, but I mean the Unitarian Universalist world generally. I'm not entirely certain that that there's an understanding of how contentious this actually is. Like, we really at moments have been on the verge of split and around these issues of splitting around the issues of anti-racism, anti-oppression work.
Splitting in two or splitting into multiple fractions?
At least two, maybe more. There are really two bigger parties.
Could you help understand? I don't find that hard to fathom, the other side that wouldn't want to be more inclusive. Or
It's not about, I mean, there is a smaller faction that does not want to be included. But I think what happened with the Commission on Institutional Change's work and the call to be and do better as religious professionals, but also as congregations to really work on our anti-racism, anti-oppression work has not been well received by the vast majority of UU congregations. And the adoption of the eighth principle is a really good show of that. And what usually ends up happening in congregations around the eighth principle is that they get stuck on the question of language. Well, we don't like the way that the eighth principle is phrased, so we don't want to adopt it. That's not the question. The question isn't about the eighth principle's language. It's actually about anti-oppressive, anti-racism attitudes. It's about that heart change that needs to happen. And yeah, we all make mistakes because white supremacy culture is what we grow up in. It's embodied in who we are. And when we make mistakes, we need to be able to say, I messed up, I'm ready, I need to change. Let's move forward. Let me apologize. Let's do better. There is there's an antipathy, right? Thank you. My word, yes, antipathy around anti-racial, anti-oppressive. There's attitudes. There's this understanding, well, our 7 principles are enough. We are anti-racist because of that. And that's simply not true. I mean, all we have to do is read the Commission on Institutional Change's report to realize that that's not enough and we need to do more. And so that is a lot of where that split is potentially coming from, is that we need to do and be better. And it's not really about people who don't believe that racism doesn't exist. It's actually people who are just not willing to do the work of anti-racism. And so I name that out because that's something that we as congregations have to figure out, of how radical are we going to be? And not just in word or deed, creed, but also in our deeds. And so actually I think that growth numbers are going to depend on that, on how well we're willing to put ourselves out there into the congregation, into the world. And so that may mean showing up for some things that make some people uncomfortable sometimes, because, trans stuff can be uncomfortable for people who are cisgender, right? Racism can be a tough issue. Immigration can be a tough issue for many people. But I think there's also another trend around growth that is often ignored, and that is retention. And so part of the way I understand growth to be is keeping our youth. We lose them we lose them big time. And that speaks to we need to do as we say we do. So that's part of that first issue. But it's also a solid religious education for our children so that they have strong Unitarian Universalist identities. It's actually having children in worship, because studies show that kids who stay in worship actually stay in the congregations that they're in or go to other UU congregations. They stay UU if they are in the service because they know what to expect and they know what it means to be part of a community. And that is true actually beyond Unitarian Universalism. That is true of all religious traditions. Any religious tradition that keeps their children in Sunday morning services has a higher retention of members as young and full adults. It just is the way that it works. So knowing that, those are the important pieces for growth. I think one of the things that happens in areas that are not historically liberal communities is that you often have the advantage of being the dissenting voice. And so that allows for growth in and of itself. So, the one thing that Oak Park has to struggle with is that it's a liberal community. Everybody gets it, right? So why would I join a church? We all get this, right? You all have the advantage that you live in a community that is not so liberal. And so you can be that dissenting voice, and just by showing up to things, you can make a difference. So on Saturday, before we went to the lovely dinner that the search committee and the board showed us, we were walking through downtown Naperville, and there was a group of young people, I'm guessing high school age, that were doing a trans protest, saying, look, we're here, we're trans, we are beautiful people. I introduced myself to them, and I said, hey, I am potentially the future minister at DuPage UU Church. If you ever need an ally, please reach out to the church. That's what we need to do. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It just needs to be, we're here. We will support you. We will offer you a place to be loved, to be accepted. That's all you need to do sometimes. And so that's how I understand growth. And I know that was a really long answer to your question, but it's complex. Yes.
I do have a question. Scott Thompson, who is a member watching from home,
Okay.
asks, can you tell us about your experience working with non-theistic and humanist UU members?
Oh, yes.
And then he has a follow-up. Do you want to follow up now?
Sure.
Okay. So,
Who Scott is.
well, Scott is one of the main people who does the Science Sunday.
Oh, yes. I think I
forums.
met Scott on Sunday. I think he introduced himself to me.
So
Yes.
and if you've watched services or Science Sunday forums, you will have seen Scott, certainly.
Yes.
So his follow-up question, the 7 principles of UU seem like they would be appealing to the growing population of nuns, the N-O-N-E-S, in our communities. What are your thoughts about reaching such people?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
principles and the nuns.
Right. So, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the fellowship movement. I mean, you all were designated as the fellowship by the UUA when you were established, but you also don't have all of the patterns of a typical fellowship. So typically, fellowships were begun. Oh, what's his name? I can't remember.
Lon somebody.
Yes, Lon somebody. There's a whole book that you can read on this.
Ben, do you know who this is?
Lon something.
It's another one-syllable name.
Yes, it's a really. He literally went.
Paul.
Yes. So he went around to local communities where he thought UU churches would be appealing to. A lot of university towns. That was a huge, because UUs tend to be well educated, right? And he began UU fellowships by doing trainings for lay leaders on how to do services, not a huge theological training, but just a general, this is how you could do services. This is Unitarian Universalism. Sometimes people would actually contact him or the UUA and that's how they became a fellowship. So fellowships are historically churches that are completely lay-led. And they worked for many, many years. They haven't been founded recently, but Morristown Unitarian Fellowship was one of them. They were a true fellowship in all senses of the word. They began by meeting in a bank. I didn't even know banks rented out space, but apparently they do, or at least they did in the 50s. And they were completely led by lay leaders. Even when they got ministers, including their second minister, whose name you may have heard of, Clark Olson. He was with James Reeb in Selma. The ministers barely preached 2 Sundays a month, and they had very little involvement in congregational life except to do pastoral care. It's a real thing. You all were designated that, but you all also had a minister from almost the beginning, which is why it makes it slightly different than a typical fellowship.
Yeah, I mean, this church was fundamentally a split in a congregational church.
Right. Yes.
With a minister who was very, very, very strong humanist.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's why you kind of fit into the category, but not really. And that's not a bad thing. It just, it is what it is. So most fellowships began out of humanism. And that's why I shared that history, because that's exactly how the fellowship was. Up until maybe 2013, their humanist group was large and vocal. And what started happening is we started bringing in people lots of families who had multiple different, so you'd have a Jewish wife and a Protestant husband, and they didn't want to go one way or the other. They wanted to find something new. And so over time, we slowly became more pluralist, which I feel is slightly more in vein of the UU tradition. We are pluralist. We are not one thing or another. But humanists have had a huge impact into Unitarian Universalism, and I have quite a bit of history at the fellowship working with humanists of all different varieties, because there are more than one type of humanist. And so we'd have lots of different dialogues. Over time, we were starting to dialogue in other ways around different theological traditions as well, which was really actually exciting. So remind me again, the second part of that question.
Second question is, the 7 principles seem
Oh,
that
yeah.
they would be appealing to the nuns. And
Yes.
thoughts about reaching the nuns.
Yeah, and actually, when the UU 7 principles were created back at the merger of Unitarianism and Universalism, that's exactly a huge segment that was appealed to the nuns. Also, a lot of the duns. Nuns as in N-O-N-E, like none, no religion. And then the duns are the other one, which is the people who are done with religion. We also have a tendency to track both of those populations. Most of the people we attracted in the early 70s, 80s, and 90s after the merger were duns, not nuns. But nuns are now a huge part of the demographic of people because they're leaving congregational settings. Yes, I agree completely. Our 7 principles are very appealing to nuns. But that's not the problem. The problem is actually getting nuns to understand that community is important. That you actually need a community to be human, honestly, but also to grow and learn and to develop. And so the principles aren't enough. We actually have to talk about what it means to be part of a community that holds us accountable, that helps us learn. A lot of nuns will start looking for communities after they have kids because they want to instill in their children a moral compass and don't know how to do that on their own, or do know how to do that on their own but don't have a community to do that, and then they start realizing, oh, maybe I need a community, and so that's often when we get them. But getting them younger is really hard because the nuns, they don't understand the other parts of what it means to be part of a religious community. It's, our 7 principles are appealing, but it's not enough. We really need to get them to understand community. And the other, I'll leave it at that. There's another thought I have, but it's more about the duns than the nuns. So, and the question was the nuns. So,
Sure.
Thank you, Mandy. I want to continue on Scott's conversation, in that we've approached things in our discussions this afternoon from a very UU perspective. But our congregation has, as you mentioned, this deep history, part UU, part influenced by UUism and part influenced by humanism. And I don't know if this is the elephant in the room or not, but it seems to have been a stumbling block for various ways for various ministers about resolving the perspectives between the Unitarian members and the humanist members of the congregation. And that's something that I'm sure the search committee has talked about in conversation with you. But also, how does addressing those two groups, or from the pulpit or from pastoral care, or how does that inform your ministry? Not necessarily from our history of being a fellowship, but how you interact with us in having those multi-facets of Unitarian Universalism and humanism.
right. So I actually want to ask another question before I answer that question, and that is, I find it's intriguing to me that you just described the congregation as Unitarian and as humanist, and not as humanists that are Unitarian Universalist. Does that make sense? Is that how you would describe it, the dynamic?
I don't know if I understand. I don't know if I personally understand enough about the dynamic itself.
Okay, that's fair.
Just
Yeah.
from what I see, perhaps.
Right.
That's what I see, but I can't speak for
The humanists. I get it.
I can only speak for myself in what I see. I can't really speak for someone who may.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Yeah, and I put you on the spot there.
That's all right.
Yeah, and the reason that ticked something for me was you are a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Yes, you pay your dues to the Humanist Association as well. Not anymore?
Well, yeah,
Yes, we do.
You do.
But it's deeper than that. It's in our founding.
Yep, in your founding
And
documents.
DNA.
Yeah, yes, and you are not a humanist society. You are not an ethical society, which is what the humanists have. You are affiliated with them, but you are actually Unitarian Universalist. Yeah, go ahead.
We're not affiliated with ethical culture.
Right, which is the humanist version of church.
This congregation, say 30 years ago, when I first started, was aggressively humanist.
Yes.
And there were a lot of people who got really twitchy if you even forget saying God. Forget saying God in the pulpit. If you even say
Right.
Spirit in the pulpit.
Right.
And a lot of the trappings of, I don't know, high church universalism with,
Right.
flame. And a lot of people
Mysticism,
twitchy.
spirituality.
Yeah.
Right.
And, the congregation evolved. We had one intern who was a pagan. That was an interesting year. And so we really have evolved, but there are still members who get twitchy about
I like that, twitchy.
things.
Twitchy. I like
Yes,
that.
I mean, it's not that they're unhappy. That's
Right.
the thing.
It's
not-
uncomfortable.
It's just, uncomfortable.
Okay.
And unhappy.
Yeah. So I.
Let us know, too.
Yes. So I just wanted to make that distinction because we do have ethical societies that are part of Unitarian Universalism, but they are ethical societies, right? And what's interesting to me all is that you all did not take that route. You could have taken the route to have become an ethical society that was part of Unitarian Universalism, but even with your large humanist population, you still all became Unitarian Universalist with roots in humanism rather than the opposite. So I just named that because it could have gone the other way. Now, what I will say is that humanism is just as important as all religious traditions in a Unitarian Universalist pluralist religion. We are by nature pluralist. And so we do need to make sure that everybody is honored and all sacred worth of everybody's individual belief system is honored, respected, and vocalized at moments, right? And so you noticed on Sunday that I included 3 different religious traditions, the Hebrew, the Buddhist, and humanism. That's how I usually tackle things. And sometimes I don't. Sometimes I only use one tradition. But I try to make it very clear that something's coming out of a particular tradition. And I am Taoist in my theological understanding, which actually I think aligns beautifully well with our Unitarian Universalism. And I have an idea in the back of my head of someday writing a theology book on UU theology and Taoism. Maybe someday that will happen. So my own understanding of the world is slightly humanist. Taoism is a bit humanist, but I also believe in the Spirit very, very differently than the Holy Spirit. That's all to say, I will move in and out of all kinds of religious language because I think it reflects all of the belief systems here and honors them all. And I welcome conversations from every person. If they disagree, if they're uncomfortable with language, if they get twitchy, as was shared, let's talk about that. Because it's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes. It's how we react to being uncomfortable. And as long as we're living into our UU values where we're respecting things, even when we're a little uncomfortable, that's okay.
Well, and Sherry, I'm glad you brought it up, and Lynn, thank you for the clarification, because I think twitchy is exactly the right word. They are not wildly unhappy, they are just fussed a little bit, right? And but
the wars have been fought.
Yes, well, they have. But we did talk in the search committee about the language of reverence. And,
Yes.
and Kat, being on Sunday services, I think was able to articulate very well the challenge
Yes.
of certain language that you use and how you would approach that. And
Yes.
what I remember was you talked about helping people understand the context in
Yes.
which you use certain words.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of us, there were times that context was missing.
Okay.
A word was used or
Right.
used lots, and we didn't know how to place it for us and for our church.
Yes.
And that was hard.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. And I just want to name that some of our biggest names in Unitarian Universalism that are humanists, David Breeden and Kendall Gibbons, are also some of our biggest proponents of language of reverence.
Yes.
Which is very interesting that is the group that is moving that language of reverence hardest.
And one of the reasons I brought this up, Karen, is because I don't want us to be here 3 years from now and have Karen 3.0.
Yes.
Because, this is something we kind of push off to the side or not quite shine a light on that ends up being a rather large burr under the saddle down the road
Yes.
that never gets addressed or is, given kind of like just, dusted off a little bit. And so
Right.
it needs to be brought out and discussed.
It was a big topic
Yes.
of our conversation with Mandy, and we we felt comfortable when she helped us understand what her approach would be. And it's not that that language will not be used, but she's gonna help us understand context. and
Absolutely.
thought. And I think we are so sometimes intellectually focused that we like that if somebody helps us understand how and why and the process of using it.
Yeah.
And I think that will go a long way probably to having people be
Right.
less twitchy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I also want to name, I have no problem having hard conversations. So if people want to come to me and say, I did not like your sermon on Sunday, okay, then let's talk about what was wrong with that. Or maybe there wasn't something wrong. Maybe we actually need to figure out why you're uncomfortable with that, and we actually need to dig deeper into that, right? There's many reasons that people are uncomfortable with things. I don't shy away from hard conversations. So,
And I have to share Scott Thompson's
Yes.
response. He said, LOL, I only get twitchy when there is an intimation that we all believe in a higher power, or we are all mystical beings, etc. As long as it's not a universal, no pun intended, claim, I'm good.
and I would agree, and that's not just about that, but I think, I would never get up and speak for all Unitarian Universalists unless it's something that's very true to our UU principles, right? It's just not, we can't do that in this space. I can't say, Jesus saves, because we don't all believe that, right?
Well, one of the things that's important to me about church is I can go to lots of services. For years, when I would teach Sunday school, I would teach Church Across the Street or World Religions. And mostly when I would go to some other service with a little bit of translation and accommodation, I could find value, mostly. But there are times when you don't want to have to translate. You want to be at home.
Yes.
And that's that's one of the things I'm looking at. But that doesn't mean I'm not willing to be open to a lot of ways to approach that.
Yeah. Yep. I hear you.
And I have to laugh when you say that about Kendall.
Welcome, newcomers.
Yes, welcome, Mark. Kay and Carolyn, we've had
Little
people.
time slot.
It's all good.
So Kay and Mark, we're just asking questions, having conversation, and at some point I do want to make sure, Mandy, that you have an opportunity to ask us things if you have things you would like to ask. But so any questions are welcome, so please ask away.
So I was intrigued by your comment about nuns being somewhat shying away from community.
Yeah.
Do you think in the broader social sphere there's more of a movement to community today than we've had in the past? Or I guess from enlightened organizational design stuff, it really calls for a lot more community. Do you see that, in the secular realm having any movement to community?
I think we're going to have to start redefining community in a lot of different ways, and part of the conversation we had earlier about technology is part of that, right? Because most teenagers these days consider themselves connected to their friends if they're texting them constantly, even if they're not seeing them, right? And so we have to better understand what community means in new contexts, and so it's going to be redefined, I think, over the coming years. But I think that it's also, there is a redefinition of community happening, but there's also a deeper disconnect that's also happening as well. And so some of the ways that we're starting to redefine community means there's less depth of what it means to be in community. So let me give you a slight example. So I'm Xennial. I'm in that little bar between Gen X and millennials. And I named that because my millennials specifically are a huge chunk of those nuns, right? They're done with, they've never grown up with any sort of religion. And that's a good chunk of my friends who, many of them don't have community, right? And the closest they get is the friends that they've created as chosen family, right? I also have at least 2, maybe soon to be 3, religious communities that I can go to and be like, hey, I'm having a really hard time struggling with something. I could use some meals. I could use a listening ear. I'd like to chat about something. I have that context, right? They have a couple of chosen family, which isn't a bad thing. It's actually really great. But that's all they got. And so that is the piece that's missing. They're redefining community as something different, but it's far less inclusive. It's far less deeply related. It's far less intimate. That's a problem. So
You don't even have to like all the people.
you don't even have to like them all, right?
Like family, you're all.
Right? I think that was one of the greatest lessons I learned at Morristown, that there were people who, they didn't really get along very much, but one of them had a crisis and the other one was there the next moment. That is a beautiful thing. It is amazing, because you just know that when somebody is in trouble, you help them, period. That's living into our UU values. And that is that piece of community. So yeah, I know there's work being done on whole community re-innovation, and it might be too little, too late. I think that the pandemic has exasperated this problem of community in a lot of ways, but emerging out of it gives us a lot of potential. And it's whether or not we're going to embrace that potential to redefine community for the nuns and for the duns as well, the people who have left their churches because they weren't connected. What can we do to revitalize it? And so I'm incredibly sad actually at the moment that we're literally calling it the Great Resignation. Ministers are resigning from their congregations at numbers that have never been seen. And that's across religious traditions. But in Unitarian Universalism, y'all are glad, you better be glad you're in search this year, because next year, even this year in the interim search, there's not gonna be enough ministers. There are gonna be churches without ministers for the next 5 years. And so part of what needs to happen is we need to stop, we need to redefine ministry. And we need to start having some excitement and some innovation and some creativity. And that's really hard to do off the pandemic. I'm not saying it isn't. And the pandemic has given us an opportunity to really embrace some new ways of being in the world. And I'm excited about that. I'm not part of that Great Resignation, just in case you were wondering.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
5 or 10 years ago, it seemed like the denomination was fretting because they were educating too many ministers and they had no place to put them.
And that's exactly right.
What happened to those people?
A part of it is there was a huge generation that are all retiring at the same time. And part of it is many ministers have reached burnout. And the pandemic has just exacerbated that.
Many ministers have what?
Reached burnout. Yeah. It's been a tough couple of years. And let's be honest, the smaller the congregation, the harder it is to minister it to. And I'm talking about under 100 people. That can be really tough for ministers. And nobody wants to go into a ministry where you're fighting your congregation at every step of the way, right?
Or you have to have another job too.
Or you have to have another job because it's not paying enough, or because you're only part-time. And so those pieces have a lot to do with that. Yeah.
Well, I know even last year in Search, there were some ministers serving 2 churches.
Yes.
You know, and think of the challenge
Yeah.
there, and they weren't tiny churches.
No.
And I just thought about how difficult that would be to deeply know 2 communities and really be able to serve them.
Yeah. I don't know how you would do it.
I don't either.
No. It's.
Before I was a member of a startup, one of your
Fellowships?
In Springfield, Virginia, and they did all of those things. I mean, the whole, 20 people showed up at the library for the first meeting. This was in the Washington, D.C. area, so it was also at a physical gap in the locations that was growing there. But that congregation went from 20 to 50 to 90 in like 2 years, but was still meeting in a school and had to buy land and a building in the Washington, D.C. area.
Yeah.
Very expensive.
Yes,
Yeah.
very, very expensive. And we did the first you have a quarter-time minister who is serving somebody who was all the way at the other side of the Beltway, which is like an
Yeah.
hour and a half away. So we had a quarter-time for a year, and then we were 3 years in a 2/3, 1/3 situation.
Yeah.
And yeah, I fell for those people.
Yeah. That's a hard thing to do. Yeah.
I'd like to change
Yeah,
a little bit.
go ahead.
But I didn't want to interrupt if we had more on this
It's okay.
topic. You're coming to us with a family,
Yeah.
and I'm really interested in how your family sees becoming part of our community, and also in terms of how the community can be supportive and important to your family.
Okay.
And there's multiple dimensions to that with kids and your husband, I think.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question for those online. The question was around my family and how they want to be part of the community and how the community might help them. My kids have struggled. They loved Morristown. They would get out of their RE classes, which they loved because all of their friends went there, and they would talk to any person anywhere in the church, and they've missed that. When I was the intern at Unity, I mean, part of it was pandemic, but they never really made the connection with anyone at Unity Temple. And when my kids walked in here, they were like, oh my God, this place feels like Morristown. Because y'all are friendly and you're a community.
We were all so thrilled to be like seeing people.
That too.
That level of enthusiasm made that nice.
Yes, I appreciate that. My family wants to be loved. They want to be participatory. They want to go to RE classes. And they know that their role is a little different because they're the minister's family. Elias travels a lot from Meadville. And so, you may see him and you may not see him every Sunday. But my kids will be around, and if it's anything like Morristown, they will own this church. They will know this church better than any of us. And they just want to be loved, and they want to chat with you, and they just want to be part of the community, especially them. And my hope is that you all will nurture them into being Unitarian Universalists.
How old are they?
My oldest is 14, and my next is 12, almost 13. So, yeah.
Well, when I came down from the sanctuary, I'm a greeter and I
Mhm.
take it very seriously. I don't want to see anybody standing by themselves during a social time. So I go over there and talk with them, and then if I figure they've had enough of me, I go send someone else over.
I like you.
If I find somebody when they're not looking, and I go over there and talk to Luna. Poor Luna is standing by herself, she's being very polite, and nobody is talking to her. So I sent several people over, and I found it delightful, but I thought, well, I better not just, she'll figure this out. So I sent people over. Lucian was a little more standoff, she's 12 years old, he's a boy. I didn't think he wanted to talk to me forever.
He was also hangry on Sunday morning. He wanted some food. So he's the most outgoing of us all. He just needed food.
But I just really enjoyed Luna and talking to her, and we shared things that were just really special, I thought. And,
Good.
And I hope that they find a lot of kids here. Sometimes I don't see very many kids here. During the pandemic, we just didn't have a lot of kids come back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd like to follow up. I was one of the people that she said.
To Luna.
You were recruited. But she didn't tell me that Luna was going into high school.
Oh,
I
okay.
had no idea how old Luna was.
Oh,
And
you're.
I taught high school kids. I should know.
Well, she's an 8th grader. and
Now I know. Yeah.
Yeah, you were the one that asked Luna if they were in college.
Might have been me. Yeah.
Yeah, Luna was like, oh my God, somebody thought I was in college. I was so cool. That was you.
I'm not sure, but it might have been. I was very impressed with her poise and savoir-faire, and I thought she just did beautifully.
Thank you. Luna's a great kid. And just a note, Luna uses they, them pronouns. Luna uses they, them for their pronouns.
I'm sure I really messed that up.
It's
I'm
okay.
not good with that. I try.
We all try. I still mess it up too, and we just keep trying. That's all we do. Yeah.
I have good news. Our daughter grew up in this church, excuse me, and she's dedicating, she and her husband, their children are being dedicated on Mother's Day at the Evanston Unitarian Church.
Oh, I'm so excited to hear that. That's fabulous. That is great news. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you.
I can't say that about mine.
Okay, everybody's different.
Yes.
Yeah. So just love them into the community. That's really what they want. They'll make mistakes and love them anyways.
But your husband, do you say husband or
Partner.
Partner. Your partner, would he be open to presenting a lecture or something? We're always looking, maybe.
You can ask him.
We will.
So Elias and I have really good boundaries. And one of those boundaries is don't ask me if you want him to do something. You have to ask him if you want to do something. Right? That's one of those boundaries that we do.
If you had set some rules or something, don't even ask him.
If there are rules there, then he'll let you know what they are. Yeah. Yes.
What's your partner's first name?
Elias.
Alias?
Mm-hmm.
How do you spell it?
Like Elias.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, right.
But it's the Spanish pronunciation. Yes,
And
Elias.
how do you prefer to be addressed?
You can just call him Elias.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've been wondering for days.
I'm glad you asked. Yes. Yes. And
uses he, him.
he uses he, him. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And we will be hopefully getting everyone's pronouns on their name tag, so it's clear, because it's something we've been needing to do, and we've started that process, so
Yeah.
bear with us as we make that move.
It's a good
I'm
shift.
still struggling.
Yes. And especially
I absolutely try, really hard.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And they, them is especially hard, right?
Yes.
It's especially because it's plural, right? And that's hard.
I
And-
understand it isn't.
We need
but
Yeah.
it's true.
Yes. And we make mistakes, we apologize and move on, right? That's what we
Their
do.
name all the time.
They, them.
Or you can use their name all the time.
Their name all the
That's
time.
That works for many people as well,
I
yes.
was at the Morgans at a sing-along before the pandemic, and Cal was talking about the friend she was with at the time, a young man, and she was saying they, and I said, who are you talking about? Everybody in the room turned to me, all these Unitarians, and said, get with the program.
No, there should be no shaming. It's just an apology and you move on. Yeah, that's it.
I have a question about how you would see outreach, particularly in this area. On the one hand, you have Naperville and some other communities. On the other hand, you have communities like Aurora,
Right.
which is where I live. That's 60% Hispanic.
Mm-hmm.
But of those of us who live in Aurora,
And we do.
yes, we mostly aren't. And,
Aren't what? Sorry.
Hispanic.
Okay.
right, that is, I'm one of the 40% who are not Hispanic. And it seems to me that that's a place where we haven't done much in the way of outreach and accessibility. I'm particularly conscious of this because my son is living in Denver, and the girl he's dating, her parents are from Mexico. And she pretty much makes all her Facebook posts in Spanish. I mean, that sounds like I'm not happy about it. I'm not. It's something that they end up going to her church because that's her, I mean, partly because that's her community, but it's
Right.
something I'm very aware of, that even in Aurora, the Spanish groceries are different. For example,
Different food.
different food, different brands, different,
Yeah.
Lots different.
lots of different things. I discovered they have chicken hearts, which I love.
Their chicken, what?
Hearts.
I'd say the letter.
That's just the beginning.
I know. But I would like to ask, do you have any thoughts on reaching out to, besides anti-racist stuff, there's the whole huge communities in this area that we don't have a lot of contact with. Probably less than we do with the black churches. And I'd like to see, do you have any thoughts about how that might happen?
So
Outreach to Hispanic.
outreach to diverse populations, generally
diverse
speaking.
populations, but again, particularly Hispanic, because that's so much in this area.
It's such a large population, Hispanics, yeah. So for me, diversity is about relationship. I do not want to go into any sort of community as some sort of savior or as some, right? It's about relationship, right? And that's both individual and as a collective community, right? And so I find that the best, I'm going to use the word proselytizing, don't mean it as conversion, mean it as more of an advertising thing, letting people know we exist, is through word of mouth. It's through the relationships you have with all of your friends. And so part of that, to become more diverse, we need to have more diverse friendships, right? And so that's becoming friends with people of different populations, both individually and as a community. So how can we as a community begin to partner on initiatives? We don't have to be the person that comes up with an idea, but what initiatives are already happening in Aurora that we can go and be in relationship with, right? Especially, I mean, we talk on Sunday. I spoke about ecological issues. I bet you there's some downtown Aurora ecological issues, fair housing issues, right? How can we partner with organizations that are already there and create a solid relationship with people? That is how I would start that and move forward from there. Because any kind of relationship requires trust that we are going to be in community together. And so that trust can only happen in relationship with each other. So that's how I begin any sort of conversation like that, if that makes sense.
Yes. It's just that it is a direction I would like to see the church
I hear that.
reach out into. My husband died last October, and
I'm sorry.
I knew my neighbor to say hello to, but that was about it. And then she and her husband have been immensely helpful. And we've been, but I was trying to explain humanism to her. She's in an evangelical church.
Yeah.
And she was having a hard time.
It's a huge cultural difference, not just to mention religious difference. Yes. Yep. Absolutely.
Wonderful. She befriended you, she does.
Yeah.
They have.
Yes.
It's about 2:30. I
Yes.
want to make sure that you have an opportunity if there are things that you want to ask us about our experiences here or anything.
So your questions have kind of informed some of what your priorities are and what some of the things that you'd like to see. I would love to hear if you all have, as you just mentioned, some of your dreams or your goals for the congregation. I know they're slightly different because of your circumstances. I know that you've all been disconnected because of the pandemic, and I've heard a lot of stuff around community building, and I totally appreciate that. And feel free to say that if that's where you feel you really would like to see the work being put together. But I would love to hear your dreams, your hopes for your community. I've also been reading the trees, branches.
Yes, which have some really good hints, right?
Some great hints.
People are feeling and thinking. If you haven't made a leaf, by the way, you have this week to do that. So
Yes.
Please participate.
Yeah. So if you have a burning dream or hope, I'd love to hear it.
Before we do that, Karen, if you can grab the handheld mic.
Sure.
And whoever speaks, just talk into the mic, since we know it's going to be more than just a...
Perfect. Thanks, Steve.
There's two switches on it, turn both switches on.
Yeah, right?
Is that good?
Perfect. All right.
Hopes, dreams, anybody?
I know some of you have been in these meetings, and so you've shared your hopes and dreams already.
I want community back. That's the thing that the pandemic has, since I've been such a long-term member, when my husband died, I was able to reach out, and there was someone there in 10 minutes. Carol Bailey says. But I miss the community a tremendous amount, and I'm a member of virtual communities. It's not the same. It's also a good thing, but I miss the community. And I think one of the things that community is going to mean and that I want for people is that ability to make a call and have someone show up in 10 minutes. And some of it is Aurora and a number of other cities in the area contract with a victim services people that does some of that kind of stuff. And she was amazed at the infrastructure that we have, but I want community back for all of us.
Are you Lynn Calvin?
I am.
I've been wondering.
I have my leaf ready for today, and I could read that, but what I'd like to add on to it is what I heard you say, Mandy, about don't be afraid of the hard conversations. I mean, I'm a clinician, so I get that at all levels, but I think it's so important. If we really want community, we have to be not afraid to have the hard conversations and not talk to our neighbor about it and complain, but to face up to what we need to talk about. And to hear you say that those, I mean, no one likes to have hard conversations. It's not like, oh, I can get up today and have a hard conversation. Yay! but that we can facilitate and help people have those hard conversations.
Yeah.
So that is a dream for me in this church, because I think many things happened here that didn't have to happen because we were afraid to have the hard conversations. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. I actually agree with you completely. Yeah. If we just take a moment to be uncomfortable for a little bit, it's amazing the intimacy and the deepening of relationship when you're willing to just sit in uncomfortableness for a few moments and work your way through it. I don't know about you, but some of the hardest conversations are with people that I have the deepest friendships with. Yeah.
And the unlayering that requires sometimes that's the whole idea of self-reflection.
Yeah.
Because we have to have that if we're going to really grow into this outreach community. We can't ignore the self
Totally.
Growth and reflection. So.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I have 2 points I want to bring forward. First of all, I know that in various areas of our widely dispersed and hybrid church, we've been doing hard work in a lot of different areas. And I think one of the areas where we've been doing hard work is in identifying where we want to go. Mm-hmm. I know that Reverend Connie's been looking at the covenanting process. Our transition team has worked really hard with the dispersed congregation to, helping to identify the building blocks of a path forward. So I hope that we don't lose that work, mm-hmm. and that we, and that work comes together and gets carried forward right. into, yes, how you help us to inform it, but that, so often it's like, oh, well, that was a different group that did this, and now we're going this way.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people put a lot of hard work yes. into helping us discern these, what's important and where we need to go and how the vision of maybe how we get there. And, your openness and willingness to work with the building blocks we have.
Absolutely.
And to, put the mortar together to build that pathway.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think, if I'm honest, that's one of the reasons that I'm here is because I liked your building blocks. I don't intend to throw them away and start something new. I want them because that's part of what attracted me to okay. you all.
Great.
Yes, absolutely.
And yes, we have a lot of good things that we do, and good groups that, some of them may need to be resuscitated as we move into this more in-person environment. But one thing I would like to see supported and brought back to a fullness is the choir. We do some awesome music, but the choir and the music would be good to see again and good to hear again.
That keeps coming up at every single committee meeting that I'm in. I have heard choir.
We miss our excellent director.
I've heard that too. Yeah, I'm so sorry.
I am born and raised Unitarian.
Very nice.
And so I identified with what you were talking about in terms of religious education being lifelong. Yeah. And I was very interested in what you were talking about from your position first as mm-hmm. the
membership
congregational mm-hmm. Life aspects of your job. I would really like to see a more robust I don't know, pathways into, I mean, you can sign the membership or you cannot sign the membership book as long as you are a part of the community. And we have I always say that there's a very valuable category of friend.
Yes. Yep.
That is, and we got to honor that. But, to see this as something that people need a continual pathway, a continual challenge
Yes.
of religious education.
Yeah. No, I
So
agree
that's my
completely. Yeah. Thank
open
you.
dream.
Yeah, there definitely does have to be, and part of that is, when you do it from the beginning, and then you root yourself and ground yourself in our identity early on, and then that moves you forward, right? And so, that's just that's a continuation. Yeah.
And Caroline's going to be modest here, but she just recently led the Building Your UU Theology course for us, so thank you, Caroline, for that.
Yeah, that was one of the first classes I took as a UU, and it's I think that's a valuable class. Absolutely.
It was more intense than I remembered it. That's okay, that's okay.
It is intense. Yes. Yes.
And not a one-time event necessarily.
No, actually, one of the things that we implemented when we were with the strategic plan that we had around membership is that we would actually have these religious education classes on a cycle, and we'd identify people that we would want to take these classes, so that we were also preparing them for leadership or for rest or for whatever, rest and renewal, whatever it was. So it really should be on a cycle. Yeah.
That's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want this, Carol?
Yeah. I live in Aurora. I've never lived in Naperville. And I have an outsider's view of Naperville as a sort of a enclosed white community that's very self-satisfied. That sounds terribly critical, and I apologize, but that's what I see. So when our previous minister got very enthusiastic about, and the congregation, I understand, voted for this as an outreach thing to the black community, which meant going almost all the way to Oak Park.
The AME Church.
Well, and that AME Church, yes. I didn't see a whole lot of enthusiasm from some people about this. Now, what remains as a remnant from that effort is, what do we call it? Help me.
The SMILE.
SMILE. The SMILE project has anybody told you about
Yes.
this? All right.
Yeah.
I think things like that we ought to be proud of somehow don't get spread around so that everybody in the church is proud of it. And it's really a big undertaking, a big deal. Mm-hmm. Cheryl Clayton isn't here. She asked me to be here as her, and you too? Okay, well then speak up. So that you'd know how hard some people have worked on this. It takes a lot of money because we pay the children what they're earning. The person they're working for doesn't pay them.
Right.
And that takes an effort.
Yep.
And
The parents get $100.
the parents get money to transport them. And it's a lot of a wonderful experience for these kids. One was assisting an attorney. Several work in various museums around town. And what else, Caroline?
Music store,
Pardon me?
music store.
Yes, various stores like that.
Police department.
Oh, yeah, we had somebody with the police department.
Okay.
And when we had a kind of a graduation service, the policeman who had been his mentor spoke very complimentary about that experience for him. So that's what we try to do. I'm not saying we're perfect, but I think a lot of outreach Another outreach effort is the Naperville Adult Daycare Center, which members of this church, I'm a member of this church, helped found more than 30 years ago in Naperville. And ever since then, somebody from this church has been on the board. I've been on it, Jane's been on it. I don't know if there's anybody else here who has been. Cheryl, that you met this morning at the
Elders Circle.
Elder Circle, yes. I can say old people's group since I'm almost as old as Molly. So I'm entitled. I'm an old lady, I'll admit it. I have white under here. But that's been another way to reach out to the community. And I know going myself to the board, I was considered sort of, there's so many Catholic people on that board, I was considered, oh, she's one of them. You know, you have to overcome that one of them feeling. And then once once you start doing things with them, then you're accepted. Right, Jane? Yeah. It's a funny experience.
That is funny.
And as you were saying, maybe for some people a little bit painful at first, but you have to get over that.
You have to get
right?
over it. Yeah.
You want to pass it?
Yes.
Just a little bit of 3/4 of the mentors that have worked with our kids have returned to work with them, a new group each year. Yeah.
That's amazing.
So there's a wonderful repeat
Yeah.
and dedication.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
And we've raised over $11,000.
that's amazing.
So how many children do you think we'll be able to put in?
She's hoping for 25 students.
Wow.
She does it. Don't ask me how, she does it.
25 kids. That's amazing. That is awesome. But, yeah,
It's in
wonderful.
process, right?
It's in
Yeah.
process.
Anyone else have a hope or dream they'd like to share?
Or any questions?
Yeah, or questions? Lynn?
I also would like to see some more understanding of UU institutional history. Because some of the pain and frustration on both sides, for instance, about anti-racist stuff, is some complicated stuff happened in the 70s
Yep.
about anti-racist efforts at that time,
Yes.
civil rights. as
Yep.
it was. And if you don't know about that, I mean, on the one hand, it's sort of irrelevant because it happened in it all, but bad things happened,
And it's still relevant.
and it's still relevant.
It is still
because
relevant.
I just read an article, probably in the UU World, about that talked about broken promises from that time.
Yep. Yep.
But if you don't know what happened, then
Mm-hmm.
what people do remember,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and I mean, it was a long time ago. I was, you know, in my early 20s, and I'm another more or less grew up, and, you know, Carolyn Bailey can probably talk to it, Carolyn Atkin, but, you know, I forget exactly what they did. One General Assembly pledged some incredible amount of money, and the next General Assembly said, "The hell you say."
Yep, the Black empowerment controversy.
Yeah. And I'd really like to see more understanding, just understanding it so that people remember.
Right. And actually what I would add to that, not only just the history, because the history actually goes back farther, like a lot farther. But what I actually think is really important, and I'm glad you said this because it was mentioned in the Commission on Institutional Change, but it's something that I'm deeply passionate about, is helping churches better understand how the UUA works, what is expected out of congregations, how we are a part of a larger movement and a larger system, and that is really important. So it's our history, but it's also our polity and our governance structure as a denomination, because I actually believe that if we came together more as congregations to do initiatives, we could get a lot more done than what we're actually doing. We often get stuck in bureaucratic nonsense, and we really could be doing some really amazing things. And part of that is because people don't understand polity, because we never actually educate anyone. I mean, I had one class in seminary on UU polity, and that's it. One class, 1 week long class. during General Assembly. And if that's all I get as a minister, and you all get nothing, right, doesn't really help us. So yes, our history, our polity, all of those pieces, absolutely. I think we had a question here.
Yes, I'm trying to remember what it was.
I know we got diverted, sorry.
Yeah,
Here, Kay.
thank you. I know of someone who would like to become a member. When is that class or whatever coming about?
I don't know when Reverend Connie has that scheduled again. Do you know, Karen?
Because you have to have people.
She just recently did a session, a class. So I'm not
Yeah.
sure, Kay, but we can find out and get back to you.
Okay.
I know she's done 2 this year already.
Yeah.
But I don't know when the next one might be taking place.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not technically your minister until
Yeah.
you vote me on Sunday, and then August 1st.
Then we can talk, right? Carolyn?
Do you know how many people joined?
I know that 5 joined last fall and at least 2 more joined this last time. Good.
Wonderful.
So there have been 7 new members this year after Connie's classes.
That's great.
So if anyone has a last thought, we're going to end in just a minute or 2 because we do have a group starting at
We
3
do.
o'clock. People who are doing, coming for the social justice and Green Sanctuary meeting. And that will be Zoom and in person. So if you want to stay and attend in person, that would be great. Some people will be joining us by Zoom.
Sounds perfect.
Mandy, any final comments that you want to?
Thank you for your time, and thank you for your fantastic questions. I'm glad that I'm here. I'm so excited to get to know all of you better.
Thank you all.
Yes,
Can
thank
we
you.
come leave chairs?
Fantastic
Oh, we need chairs.
Thank you.
All the people with the more flexible schedules.
Yeah.